One of the central conceits of magic from antiquity down to this day is that the possession of a secret name can give you power over the named. Be it persons, angels, demons, spirits, planetary entities, or elementals, having knowledge over an especially secret name provides the ritual practitioner with power over that entity. And indeed, this logic even extends all the way up to the gods in some cases. And the ancient collection of the Greek Magical Papyri is positively overflowing with such powerful secret names, often couched in mysterious forms, long palindromes, and combining Greek, Hebrew, and Egyptian words into a thick quilt of magic still poorly understood even down to this day. But one of the more profound ritual procedures still preserved in two forms in PGM XIII, or Leiden Papyrus J 395, is pretty conspicuous. Rather than just revealing a divine name and its magical uses, this elaborate and complex ritual is precisely for learning just such a divine name, and indeed the divine name above all others, in a text that calls itself the 8th Book of Moses. Stretching over 730 lines, the 8th Book of Moses is one of the best preserved magical manuals of the ancient world. And, fascinatingly enough, it's preserved in two distinct editions in one manuscript, filled with astronomical timings, inscriptions, for which must be licked off and consumed, the sacrifices of animals and incense, double initiations, and even a creation story filled with cackling laughter, all stretching over weeks, which, if accomplished properly, result in the revelation of a divine name, one's secret fate, and the power that encompasses all things. Make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica for explorations of topics in esoteric history. And if you'd like to support this work of providing evidence-backed, accessible content on topics like this, I'd hope you consider checking out our Patreon or some of the merch we have here on the channel. If you're new to the study of esotericism and you want a reliable lay of the land in terms of the literature, make sure to check out my study guide. And if you're interested in actual historical antiquarian books on topics in the occult and the mystical, check out our bookstore over at Esoterica Rare Books. You can find all those links in the description and in the pinned comment below. But now, let's explore the magical, secret eighth book of Moses. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. The origin of the codex that became PGM XIII, or the 8th Book of Moses, is shrouded in mystery and intrigue, as it should be. Like other amazing magical papyri, such as the stupendous PGM III or the Great Magical Papyrus Codex, they begin with one Jean d'Anastasie, who perhaps was Armenian birth, but somehow became the consular ambassador for Sweden in Egypt, who comes in contact with a veritable library of papyrus scrolls and texts in the 19th century. Now, how he got these and where they originally came from? Maybe Thebes, probably tomb robbing. This substantial collection would eventually make its way up to Europe before being auctioned off and landing in various collections and institutional holdings. It's possible that the magical collection itself was actually all originally found in one cache, perhaps buried with an ancient ritual practitioner, or from a ruined library that was toppled and sealed in antiquity. We're probably never going to know, but it could probably be an Indiana Jones movie at this point. But the text, as we are going to be exploring it, now known as PGM XIII, and ultimately ended up in Leiden in the Netherlands, where it remains today. I'll be showing some images of it on the screen as we work through it. The text is a papyrus codex as opposed to a scroll, dating to sometime in the mid-4th century, composed of 14 leaves, or about 28 pages, 25 of which are inscribed, making up some 1,077 lines in Koine Greek. Within the codex, there are two versions of the same ritual. The first, or A version, occupies lines 1 through 343, and the second, or B version, occupies lines 343 to 734, with another series of rituals, perhaps even another text known as the 10th? The 10th Book of Moses, occupying lines 734 to 1077. While a previous generation of scholarship, here I'm thinking of Morton Smith, argued that the Codex actually held 3 different versions of the same ritual, scholarship has now walked that back and settled on it being 2 distinct versions. Thus, it's actually better to study the text in more recent editions, such as the one by Klutz, rather than looking at the one in the classic, though honestly outdated, Betts edition of the Greek Magical Papyri that I know we all know and love. As I mentioned in the introduction, the primary goal of the text is to become properly initiated so as to learn a powerful, perhaps the most powerful divine name, so as to 1, obtain knowledge of and obviate one's fate, along with other knowledge of the self perhaps, and 2, to wield that magical name for practical magical ends. In terms of genre, aside from being one of the most extraordinarily complete magical manuals of antiquity, the text is a kind of tour de force of ritual and religious syncretism. There are Jewish elements. The text is named for, well, Moses. It swears by the Temple of Jerusalem. It contains Hebrew words of power, along with indigenous Egyptian elements, including numerous divine names, ritual dependence on Egyptian astrology, and regional religious forms. Further, there are Hermetic invocations and rituals, along with some Gnostic elements, all blended together into an elaborate ritual composed in the common Greek dialect of the time. But this religious and ritual syncretism sometimes sits uncomfortably within the pages of the ritual itself. The text clearly leans on the history and prestige of Moses. The text is described as being extracted from the original Torah and references such Mosaic texts as the Key of Moses, the Archangelical Book of Moses, the Secret Moon Book of Moses, and perhaps even, as I mentioned, a 10th Book of Moses within the Codex following at line 734. And yet, despite this Mosaic priority, the text also employs Hermetic invocations despite claiming that Hermes' book, the Wing, actually plagiarized Moses' rules, for instance in the ingredients and preparation for the incense of the gods, a topic very much that would have been at home in the practical Hermetica. Thus, there's some Mosaic Hermetic beef in the text that actually goes back to centuries, all the way back to people like Artapanus, who claimed that, in fact, Moses was both. So, what explains why there are 2 versions of the same ritual in one codex? I've seen 2 reasonable explanations for this. The first is that the A version is a more fully elaborated text, while the B version is just truncated and more brief, perhaps a deficient copy or just an aid to memory for a skilled ritual practitioner. However, the B version does contain elements not found in A, especially for ritual behaviors, including breathing techniques upon the appearance of the angel Serapis. Yeah, the angel Serapis. And ritual timings especially aligned for the seasonal flooding of the Nile, giving it a more indigenous Egyptian feel. Interestingly enough, all the Mosaic language of the text, including a few Christian interpolations, only really occur in the A edition, and this leads me and other scholars to the possibility that the B edition is actually an earlier, more pagan edition of the text, with the A version being more fully syncretized with especially Jewish and Christian elements. Now, the question is, why would someone syncretize a pagan Egyptian text with Christian and Jewish elements which are allegedly monotheistic? Well, recall that the manuscript as we have it dates to the 4th century, while the original ritual probably dates back centuries prior to that. And in the 4th century, we have a time period where Egypt was increasingly Christianizing. It seems reasonable to me and other scholars that the text simply underwent mosaification to make it more appealing to Christian clients. And yes, we have numerous examples of Christian magic from this period. You can check out my episode on just that topic. But recall that by the 4th century in Egypt, Egypt is actually witness to a rapid decline, really suppression of the indigenous Egyptian religion, with the last known hieroglyphic inscription occurring on the 24th of August, right around now, in 394 of the Common Era, in one of the last temples left operating at the time down at the Osiris Temple all the way at the Nile and Philae. So this text is being composed at the twilight of Egyptian paganism and with the rise of Christian hegemony. Magic simply adopts to the times. You used to serve pagans, now you gotta serve your magic to Christians, and you make it sound more vaguely Christian. As for genres of similar text from this time period, we can compare the 8th Book of Moses to texts like the Greek Magical Papyri, or PGM XIII, which it was probably found with, and especially texts like the Mithras liturgy of PGM III. But also, there's a lot of surviving Jewish magical texts from this time period as well. The Sefer HaRazim, the Book of Secrets, the slightly later Charbad Moshe, the Sword of Moses, the Incantation Bowl literature, and also the Hechelet literature, especially the Hechelet Zutarti, which is full of incantations and technical astrological treatises of this time, most of which, basically all of which, I've covered in other episodes here on the channel and in extended seminars like in our Hechelet seminar. But let's turn to a summary, a pretty brief summary of the ritual itself. But as you can imagine, just as a kind of disclaimer, this is the kind of ritual text that is highly resistant to summary. And I know I say that a lot on this channel, but this is a magical ritual. You're supposed to do all of it, so me summarizing it is going to necessarily simplify things and leave things out. So maybe this will prepare you to go read the text for yourself, or do it, I don't know. Also, I'm going to be relying primarily on the fuller A edition, but filling in interesting details from the B edition as they appear. But to begin, you have to calculate when the final ritual initiation and revelation will take place, which has to occur on a new moon in Aries, which occurs about once a year. So in 2026, this year, this was back on April 17th. And so next year, which will be the next time you can do this ritual, I think I've calculated to be Tuesday, April 6, 2027. So pencil that into your calendar. Now, with this date set, you're going to have to remain pure for 41 days prior to the final initiation and revelation, though we're not told exactly what maintaining purity is here specifically. And you're going to have to get to work. You need to be building and outfitting the ritual space. Thus, the ritual takes some 42 days total, and you can actually compare that to similar time periods in literature like the Sar Torah angelic conjuration from the Hechelet literature, with ritual events occupying, in this case, in 7-day intervals, again, perhaps under the influence of Jewish or Christian influence. Now, in order to build the ritual space, you need to make sure that no one has died there in the past year. You need to have a door facing to the west, and have a ground floor level in which you're going to prepare an earthen altar upon which incense and sacrifices are going to be performed. Yes, this ritual does involve rooster and pigeon animal sacrifices, so definitely not vegan or vegetarian. As for the practitioner, you're going to eventually have to don some pure linen robes, an olive wreath, and you're going to have to get a rush mat to sleep on in the last 7 days of the ritual. You're going to build up that central article. You're going to place cypress wood on it, 10 pine cones with their seeds, 2 oil lamps partially filled with good oil, but not overfilled. The text tells us that when the god appears, they're going to burn at greater intensity, and you don't want them to overflow, I suppose. One then prepares and lights the ritual incense to kick off the ritual. For Kronos, we have Styrax. For Zeus, we have Malabathron. For Ares, we have Kostos. Helios, we have frankincense. Aphrodite, Indian nard. Hermes, cassia, and Selene, myrrh. Exactly which one is supposed to light is actually determined by the astrological timing chart given at the end of the text. So I think next year, if you're going to be doing the ritual, you would be lighting on a Tuesday, so that's ruled by Aries, so Kostos, along with Sunvetch needs to be on the altar for reasons that aren't clear. Next, at 21 days prior to the initiation, you need to take and dry the 7 flowers of the 7 stars: madrum, white lily, lotus, Erephilion, narcissus, gillyflower, and rose, which are pulverized in a white mortar and set to dry. Hence, you need 21 days to do that. When they're dried, these 7 flowers of the 7 stars are combined with the 7 incenses, and they're used to prepare a sacred ink. Around this time as well, you're also going to be preparing a canopy or a tent, perhaps over the altar, which needs to be rather large because it needs to cover that area, and you're going to be dwelling inside of it, lying inside of it, maybe even sleeping in it for the final theophany. Further, it needs to be rather large because you're going to be writing down the entire list of the 365 Egyptian gods of the days around the edges of the canopy. Now, the names of those gods are not mentioned in the text, but they were probably gathered from other technical astrological manuals, and by the way, they can still be seen in temple inscriptions in Egypt to this day at Dendera and Edfu. The canopy also may have had sacred marriage undertones, though I'm not sure about this, and I might be anachronistically putting back ideas from later religious practices. One also needs to don some cinnamon around one's neck. Apparently the god likes this aroma and has even given it some dunamis, or energy, or power. Cinnamon has its own special dunamis, and around late August, who doesn't like the smell of cinnamon wafting in the air? That's also probably me projecting back. At any rate, now you take a root of a laurel tree upon which you're going to carve an elaborate image of Apollo with a tripod next to him and a Pythian serpent, around which there are going to be various elaborate magical names and words of power carved on both sides, including very long palindromes. So you're going to be carving relatively small. One of these names is going to appear later, by the way, in the Cosmogenic text that we're going to get to in just a moment. This amulet's to be worn around the neck, so the ritual object needs to be relatively small, I suppose, thus indicating some degree of skill for the carver. So you need to work on your wood carving skills. Then on whatever auspicious new moon, though during a 42-day ritual, there's a pretty limited choice here of what new moons you could choose from, one undergoes a preliminary initiation for the gods of the hours of the day prior to the main event. Again, this ritual is a two-initiation ritual, and this is probably a technical list of the Egyptian gods. The list tells us they're described in the key of Moses, which we don't have, but these may be the gods of the Amduat. This initiation is going to occur also beneath the canopy and requires that one sense and eat various deity cakes in the form of a bull-faced god, a goat-faced god, and a ram-faced god, each standing on their celestial pole holding the classic Egyptian flails, followed by specific incantations, the compulsive formula, which we don't have, and all along are going to be the gods of the deacons. Now, Dr. Kristen Switza has made the fantastic point that all three of these deities represent deities that would have been worshipped along specific geographical locations up and down the Nile, thus representing a kind of pan-Egyptian initiation. You're literally making images of the gods from all over Egypt and ingesting the entirety of the Egyptian pantheon, which makes some sense considering you're sort of warming up to an initiation to the greatest god of all. You sort of swallow the pantheon in order to get access eventually to the greatest god of them all. Now, just what happens during this preliminary initiation isn't clear at all. In fact, the text provides the ritual instructions and just moves on. So I guess one of y'all out there are going to have to go find out and let us know. Have fun and send my best to those gods of the day. Now we come to what is probably the central object of this ritual, the natron tablet. Now, natron, as you probably know, is a naturally occurring mineral, a salt really, of mostly sodium carbonate dihydrate with around 70% sodium bicarbonate and little quantities of sodium chloride and sodium sulfate. Most famously, it was used in Egypt as the primary desiccant in the mummification process, but it was also used in the production of ceramics and glass. Now, we take a square of this mineral and we write upon it with an ink made, remember, from the incense and the flowers of the stars. The great name here we're going to have of several vowels, along with drawing an image of a falcon-headed crocodile deity named Sochnopaios, with the mysterious nine-form god around him, all surrounded by an Ouroboros, the tail-eating snake. And we do this ritual text on both sides. There's an inscription on one side and a ritual text on the other. The ritual text directly calls upon the self-begotten creator deity who ordered all of creation and is seemingly the target of this ritual. Interestingly enough, this deity is ritually called upon in a sort of panoply of language, perhaps representing every language. In vowel hymns, the bird glyphics and hieroglyphics, in Egyptian, in Hebrew, in Babunic, like the language of Thoth perhaps, in Falconic, perhaps the language of Horus, in hieratic, and then in the chomping and hissing sounds of that very crocodile deity. Following the construction of the natron tablet, further resuscitations occur. The names of the gods of the hours, of the day and the week, the reading of the stele itself, another compulsive incantation, which again isn't present, followed by a series of 9 names, the nature of which isn't clear again. But listen to what we're repeating. The days of the hours and the weeks and the months is as if the entire calendar is being brought to bear on this idea. The ritual also assumes extensive ritual wisdom outside the context of this specific ritual undertaking. Interestingly, the text also provides an alternative ritual for this one. If one just simply pronounces with enthusiasm, the text tells us, the god of the day and the hour, again, seemingly provided with the charts at the end of the text, but missing. Perhaps they were actually meant to be written in a lacuna, but the lacuna doesn't actually fill the text in. But now we come to the final 7 days of the ritual before the revelation on the Aries new moon. We're told to sleep for that week on a mat of rushes during this period, to rise at dawn and to greet Helios and recite the names of the gods of the hours and the weeks, almost pestering them as the Klutz translation actually has it. This goes on for the next 7 days and we finally reach day 42, the culmination of the ritual. Yeah, I know some folks out there are seeing maybe some similarities to the Abramelin ritual of centuries later, but is there a connection? Probably not a direct one, though it seems like rites of ascesis, ritual, and revelation seem pretty not uncommon in Western magic. But at around 11 p.m. on that 42nd night, we have just 1 hour to go, and it's going to be a frenzied hour. You need to go under the canopy, light the incense on the altar, sacrifice one of the pigeons and one of the roosters, light the 2 lamps, recite 2 other invocations, only one of which is provided, then lick off the invocation written on the natron tablet. Yep, you got to lick it off, like a salt lick. You pour a libation of honey and wine over the other side of it to erase it into a crater or a mixing bowl filled with wine unmixed with seawater and milk from a black cow. Then you utter the provided Hermaic invocation, again functioning a kind of an invocation of all the gods and all the languages. You drink the milk wine incantation mixture and you lie down on the rush mat. After all of that, I imagine you're going to want a break anyway. Version B actually gives even more detailed invocations, even seemingly to note that the being that might be appearing, at least at first, could be an angelic form of the god Serapis. Then again in version B, following some brief breathing instructions and invocations of the names in various dialects, kneeling to the earth, moon, water, and heavens, then no one is now perhaps meant to fall asleep in the canopy, such that the deity will appear in a dream state, or in a waking state. We're told the deity will appear, and we're not to gaze upon the deity, but to look down at their feet and simply write down with iron on iron what the god reveals to the aspirant. And it's at this text that the ritual has its single most puzzling dimension, a detailed and perplexing account of the creation of all being, the gods, and the cosmos, a full-blown theogyny. This creation account, which seems to occur prior to the revelation of the god, honestly, a lot of this ritual seems to capitulate beginnings and endings, and it details the origins of the gods and the creation itself in divine laughter. Laughter. Yeah, the primal divinity creates the various gods and emanations through laughter, not speech. Laughter. The pattern here is relatively straightforward. 7 instances of laughter which generate 7 deities. Light, earth from primordial water, mind, and fertility, those are all each with a specific magical name attached. Then the mood of the text changes for the 5th, Moira, or fate, which is issued from a laugh, but then followed by divine gloom. Here, fate or Moira and Hermes or mind, they contend with each other, with Moira ultimately given jurisdiction over the lower worlds. The sixth laugh produces kairos, an opportune time. And finally, the sixth laughter produces soul, or suke, which sets the cosmos into motion in version B. However, for whatever reason, God hisses or snaps. Again, this is crocodile symbolism, which produces in A, the Pythian serpent, whose name is engraved, at least in part, on that Apollo amulet that you're supposed to be wearing from earlier. But in the B version, this produces phobos, or fear, as a kind of echo. Then the god clicks, generating Yao, the Lord of all, which in the B version actually is uttered as Yao by the divine, which freezes the cosmic motion. Of course, Yao is well known in the Greek Magical Papyri as a version of the Israelite god and a demiurge-like character in some Gnostic mythologies. We learn further that this Yao actually startled the primal god as if the earth had cast up a god. But Phobos contends with Yao given its ontological priority, but the matter is settled in version B given that Phobos is a mere echo while Yao was an actual utterance of the divine. And strangely enough, in B, Phobos and Yao are seemingly given power over the previous 7 gods and to rule over the 7 planets. Thus, with Phobos and Yao ruling, there seems to be a kind of Gnostic demiurgic element here with fear and Yaos ruling over the cosmos, at least during this period, but the theogyny kind of ends here and doesn't really dwell on it at any length. But what should one expect when the god shows up? What is supposed to be revealed in all of this? Both versions agree that what's going to be revealed is a hidden, specific divine name, the nature of which is said to have enormous power, some of which are going to be enumerated in A, and I'll come back to them shortly. But in B, it makes it very clear that what you're going to learn about is your ascendant deacon and the nature of your fate more generally, specifically where you're going to live and where you're ultimately going to die, along with other details, presumably. The specific detail about the ascendant deacon that you have at your birth and what sort of daimon you have is a distinctly Middle Platonic, quasi-external daimon that was just one soul in Middle Platonism and philosophers like Plutarch. But also, there's a hermetic element here, with the Corpus Hermeticum arguing that planetary daimones infect the soul as she passes through the zones as it comes to dwell inside the human body. Further, the concern with fate is distinctly pagan in many ways. Both Jews and Christians rejected the concept of fate on covenantal theological grounds. Hence, it seems to vanish almost completely from version A, where the Jewish and Christian elements are most pervasive. But in B, that seems to be the central concern, to learn about one's daimon, to learn one's fate, and to be able to make a request such that that fate can be obviated and averted. Again, this is a real central pagan concern from Stoicism to Hermeticism in the ancient world. But then, finally we learn that we may perform the rite again, and that this rite is indeed the best mechanism by which the god can be persuaded for us to learn our fate and to obviate it. However, in the text in A, as it begins to come to an end, it informs us that as we swore by the temple in Jerusalem, we need to hide or dispose of this book such that it cannot be found after we've been filled with the divine wisdom. Again, divine wisdom, or chokhmah, seems to be a specifically Jewish concern here. This is a rather unusual in the instruction in the PGM generally. Often we need to encrypt books or hide elements, but not dispose of the whole book. That said, version A now provides a litany of uses of the secret name, a feature actually quite common to the PGM. It's actually this section that's much more like the rest of the PGM generally, such that we use various ingredients along with writing or saying the divine name in order to do things like provide the user with invisibility, to kill birds, to do love charms, to make people appear repulsive for some reason, exorcisms, curing broken bones, halting cobras, good old-fashioned resurrection of the dead, crossing over the Nile while riding on a crocodile. Sounds like the Fonz. Quenching fire, releasing from chains. This one actually specifically invokes Jesus as Christos, such that, another one such that your wife won't sleep around. And finally, one for invoking Helios, in which you declare yourself as the god riding upon 2 cherubim. Again, this is distinctly Merkava imagery, with the spell being a real Mary Jane of magic, with it actually having specific powers to do, quote, just about everything. At any rate, a real buffet of magical powers. The text comes to an end with a final colophon as, quote, the secret 8th book of Moses, or, and I think this may have been the original title, concerning everything which pertains to the name of him who governs all things. But then it just picks back up with another related text which seems to call itself the 10th book of Moses, a text which contains a more or less motley collection of ritual procedures, but one that I think I'm detecting some patterns in and I want to come back to later. But yeah, I know, what about the 6th, 7th, and 9th book of Moses? Well, some of those do kind of show up hundreds of years later, and the seeming 10th book of Moses at the end of PGM XIII is worth an exploration all its own, but that's a whole nother episode, folks. Regardless, the secret 8th book of Moses in PGM XIII, or just as PGM XIII, is one of the standout rituals of that vast collection and well worth a careful study. You can see the original manuscript online, and I would consult the Klutz edition in Volume 1 of the Davila Old Testament Pseudepigrapha volume, rather than in the older Smith translation in the Betz edition of the PGM that I know we all know and love.